yourself. Okay, let's try this again. And of course, David's mistake is a result of my error, I guess. I don't quite know what's happening sometimes.
Yeah, I wouldn't worry too much, Johnny.
So here we are. Hi, I'm John Barnwell here in the city of Detroit, the Straits. And I'm here with the Reverend Bishop David William Parry. He gets to wear one of those Egyptian-style hats, you know. And he's over in the city of London. We're pursuing truth in our usual style. It's merely an artistic approach, a representation of truth, kind of an impressionistic image of truth at best, where we blur the lines in an effort to peek around the corners. So, Reverend David, how are you there, my friend?
Right, I'm back out of mute and hoping everything's working this time.
You got no sound there. No, you gotta turn it on your computer. Can you hear him? Well, why can't I hear him? Okay, there we go. Okay, we're good now. We can hear him. They can. The only one that couldn't hear you was me. And I fixed it. So I guess I don't know. I'm at times like a milk crate falling down the stairs, but that's okay because we will keep tilting at windmills. So again, once again, Reverend David, how are you? It's hard to segue into something profound after that little debacle.
Very profound. Everyone should read Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. There we are. No, I don't see you as some sort of. I don't see you as something waiting to happen, an accident waiting to happen. I see you as my friend and an American gentleman of letters. And I'm always reminded by your good and learned company, not only why I still love America, but also the wonderful differences between what was once an American academy and once a British stroke European academy. And they were wonderful differences. They weren't differences per se are not bad. Sometimes they're wonderful. To get a different perspective, a different point of view, it's absolutely engaging. And I think most people in the traditional British academy, the Francis Bacons of the world and so on, would have seen delightful differences in the optimism, the energy, the enthusiasm, the sort of devil-may-care attitude of the Americans compared to the browbeaten British who've been through too much and can't take much more. So I suppose, no, viva the Americas, viva the Americas. As for me, gremlins, everything I do at the moment is to do with gremlins in tech. I don't know why. Perhaps somehow things are trying to stop us from communicating. As for me on a personal level, actually they're just about to make me Archbishop. So for does it come with any money? Does it come with any money? It's for my services to the independent Catholic movement, which I'm interpreting as someone who's just got the cheek to keep going when everybody else is heading for cover and nobody's talking about anything. Yes, I had the cheek to keep going. So there's all that going on. What else? Let me think. Yeah, I mean, everything's sort of dandy. The nights are getting shorter, thank heavens. I love autumn. I don't like winter. All these sort of Albion-esque nights, long and dark and wet and damp and freezing, and not to my taste. My partner and I are planning to move to Edinburgh, as I said, and this time next year, hopefully, we'll already be ensconced in the Venice of the North. So as for London, it can do whatever it's doing. would Dr. Johnson really have said those things? If he was living in modern London, I really doubt it. If you're tired of London, good, you've got a brain, get out, is what he would have said nowadays. As opposed to, you've got to remember the time differences. The modern world is very, it has problems with the notion of time. I've noticed that. Millennials want everything here and now, which is just odd. I mean, life isn't like that. They're working on the premise that we don't want that, but we do want that. We just know it doesn't happen. And the older generation, present company, truly accepting, because I never think of you as that. I don't know. I think we're just browbeaten at the minute into some sort of quasi submission, and thinking, my God, how much more oppressive can things get? The answer, of course, is they get much more oppressive. So we're looking on the bright side. Dusting off our tails, as Fred Astaire used to say, and getting in the groove. How about you, John? Oh, yeah. And why do you say the straight city? Obviously, I wouldn't fit there if it was the straight city.
The Straits, as in a partition. It has to do with Canada being across the Straits of Detroit. That's where all the rum runners would come in from the Seagram's plant, and then the sneaking the Johnny Walker across the lake when it would freeze over about this time of year. They did a hefty business with the Purple Gang and all those other shady underworld types. So anyways, on to better subjects, but not in no reference to what you said. It's just all the stuff I seem to trail off into. And oh yes, Paula's here from Amsterdam. Paula, I got your nice card wishing me a happy new year, and I'm sure that extends to everybody here and everybody who isn't here. And so thank you very much. That was very thoughtful. Yeah, I started to think about what we've been doing here, and I thought that I would share a little bit. Posted below, there is a link to an article that was a result of a great deal of effort on my part when I worked with Ralph Barinelli. If I can find it here. Of course not, because I had computer problems, and it caused me to close the things that I had available, so that if I just go to the right spot, I will find it again. Hold on a second. Why don't you continue while I do some searching here?
I assume that's a theatrical call to the wings and beyond.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there should be two big projects from me this year. As my work, you'll love this, gets increasingly anthroposophical. This is an anthroposophy show. I wish beyond. I wish some of our confreres would realize that this is actually an anthroposophy show. I am a member of the society, and John is a long-term anthroposophist. I mean, I picked in and out of it. I was a member years ago, and I'm a member again. And the attitude, I suspect it fits in perfectly with my previous, if previous is the right word, it's not, Swedenborgianism. For the simple reason, actually, they're both types of anthroposophy from a theological view, and I tend to veer towards that if ever I've got that cap on. I mean, I'm not actively involved in the intellectual life of the church, directly. I'm not some sort of theologist or theologian. Yes, I do think there's a difference, and I think it's important. Debating doctrines, oh my God, how tedious. But I do hope my humble work has some sort of input, in which case, yeah, I mean, I think that angle is absolutely vital and I'm going to really put my head on the block. Not that anybody's going to attack, I don't think. That really is the unique Abrahamist position. I mean, when St. Paul is, and I promise I'll give a pass back to you, John. When St. Paul is talking about his exasperation, I mean, it happens in a couple of places, about the heathen, that word cannot be taken at face value when the apostle, capital A, is using it. When pagans, I notice he's slightly more lenient with the word pagans, when the heathen completely misunderstands what a Christian is trying to say, I think that is pregnant with meaning, and you're looking at something more like an anthropology of theology there. Is it the human paradigm? Is it something personalist that is the unique revelation, the unfolding of the divine through Christianity, Judaism, and Islam? And which is really why those other views, as the apostle says, simply cannot understand what we're talking about. That has put my head on the block, but I think that's probably worth discussing at some point. So for me, I'm in very home territory. I'm on very familiar territory and learning bit by bit. What I absolutely don't want to do is make it another course of studies. You know, what's the quickest way to drain everything of life and joy? Make it a course of studies. So I'm reading a bit here and I'm reading a bit there and I'm dipping in and out and finding my way back into the living society and enjoying it that way. I just wish they realized we love you, anthroposophy, and sort of said hi more frequently. Apart from that, there we are, and I'll hand back.
Yes, the beat it down with the dry, dead bones of reason. Well, you know, there's a way in which I, myself, in my own personal pursuit, assess books. You know, like there are particular authors that if I look at them, it's like the description that oh, somebody was thanking me for something. You're very welcome. Anyways, where was I? Oh yeah, Rudolf Steiner talked about that when one reads the Gospel of St. John, one gets the feeling as if they're walking through a meadow of flowers. And that to me was very inspiring when I first encountered it some, I don't know, 40, 50 years ago. And that particular passage kind of led into my own sense of sensitivity. And okay, well, if the Gospel of St. John can be like my whetstone, that's the way in which I can evaluate other writings. And so I found that to be true, what he said for me personally. For somebody else, I can't answer. And so when I would look at books, remember I ran the largest metaphysical, esoteric, and holistic bookstore in the world for many years, Mayflower Bookshop. And when books would come in, I just open them up and look at them. And the feeling that I got intuitively from some of them, I call granulation. And that's like where the book is like, I feel like it's a cellar door leading into entropy. Or that at any moment I'm gonna like cave into a black hole. And it's all in gradations, of course, but it led to things that I thought didn't resonate for me personally. They had a materialistic perspective, and but in the same token, I would force myself out of curiosity to read that type of stuff nonetheless, because it's a great ability to be able to read things that you don't agree with. And so that's a very cherished ability. And I respect that. And so does Reverend David. So that's don't get me wrong here, but and since you mentioned Lord Bacon, I'm sorry, but we had a nice, really nice 5-volume set in French, 3/4 leather that was, a couple 100 years old edition. And every time I'd open that, I had the strongest sense of granulation that I can't even begin to tell you. I guess it ties into his perspective on torturing the secrets out of Mother Nature. And so I think that he meant well, but his cast of mind was a sign of the times, shall we say, that there was that, and that there's that stage of consciousness, not to be condescending, but that there's that way of looking at things that is, just like reductio ad absurdum, that you, in attempting to relegate everything to material cause, seems to be the fly in the ointment, and because if you do that, then you're negating the possibility of that there's any kind of spiritual cause, when essentially within the esoteric Christian viewpoint, everything has arisen from the world of spirit ultimately. And so it gets a little problematic when you're dealing with individuals that get locked into that materialist viewpoint. And I've encountered it time and time again. In fact, it's running rampant today, is that they want to find material solutions for things that they automatically assume are entirely material in nature. And yes, a meadow of flowers, how life-giving. And so I guess when you get into what you were saying regarding scripture, it's interesting because if you just go back to what Rudolf Steiner, he does an interesting perspective in a cycle of lectures called The Background to the Gospel of St. Mark. And the Gospel of St. Mark is the one in the Gospel in which is symbolized in the Gothic cathedrals by the lion. So it represents that heart center. And if you look at a lion, for example, and you get into trying to comprehend what they are the middle region, that rhythmic thing. And so cats in general are quite fascinating, and that their favorite thing to do is to just sit there and enjoy the fact that they're just sitting there, enjoying the rhythms of the universe. So there's that rhythm that they develop as purring, which is really essentially a rhythmic relationship between the breathing and heart rhythm that allows them to enter into a certain state of being. And that is really the Gospel of Mark. That's that whole cosmic understanding. Mark was the apostle that went to Egypt at the instruction of St. Peter, and it was in Egypt that he came into contact with Ormus, who was the priest from the Serapis. He met him in Alexandria, and Ormus ended up becoming his representative in Alexandria for Christianity. And out of that impulse came the traditions of the lodges, the lodges of the builders. And so there's that whole mystery impulse. And when you get into understanding that particular stream, it has to do with orientation and relationship to space. And so you look at like the ancient Egyptian temples, and that they constructed them according to alignments with particular stars. And likewise, that's the case with your cathedrals in Europe. For example, the series, you can look on a map and make a mark on a map of France of the cathedrals dedicated to the Blessed Virgin, right? and that the Notre Dame series of cathedrals makes the constellation of the Great Bear on the map of France, which is like quite remarkable to do that. And then you go and you look at the receptories of the Knights Templar, which are related to this stream, and you see that they have also astronomical alignments for their installations. And so when you start getting into that, this is something that we've lost. We've lost the cosmic relationship to space. We've lost the cosmic relationship to language. We've lost the cosmic relationship to the arts. And I say this, and I say in the most part, because yes, there are those, of course, that are attempting to work in those directions. But as we came into the modern era, we tended to break away from this cosmic understanding that was essentially in the pre-Christian era arising out of a relationship to the astral world, with the stimulation of the I am impulse through the incarnation of Christ. It became time for us to be able to arrive at the spiritual world out of the individual human ego, the I am, that which says I. And you can only say I about one thing, and that's yourself. See, so that's your individual nature. So why the Gospel of St. Mark? How is that related to time? Well, if you look in the Gospel of St. Mark and you look at times of day in the Gospel of St. Mark, something that Rudolf Steiner points out, he says that it was at sunset that Jesus Christ would go to see people for healings. I mean, you can go look it up. That's when it happened. Why? Why was it at that time of day? Is there some mystery associated with it? And Rudolf Steiner was very clear to point out that the destiny of the incarnation of Christ as it relates to mankind is the purest expression of the macrocosm in a human form. So you have the actual macrocosmic ego, the source of our microcosmic ego that is derivative. It's as if it dropped from the ocean, that we have our individual nature. And so when this first came to us through the agency of the Christ, it was as a group experience that was beyond the consciousness of mankind. It worked unconsciously, and through the incarnation of Christ and expressing it in an individualized way, now we have the possibility of unfolding our human ego in a fully individuated way, and the purpose being to be able to develop ourselves into this, what Rudolf Steiner described as the spirits of freedom and love. And so if you look at that perspective on it, you look at what Christ did, what did he do? What was the thing that he did the most, perhaps? And it was healing. That he was always attempting to bring harmony to the world around him, to reorient people to where they were pulled out of pathological conditions. And so there's a great many healing miracles. And likewise, in the history of Christianity, there were cases of that, like St. Francis or St. Bernard. It's known that St. Bernard, he even did a larger number of healings, apparently, than our Lord is described as doing in the New Testament. And he did it out of his purity of his nature, that he had gone through such a complete catharsis that the healing forces were able to express in him so thoroughly, because the idea of becoming unwell to a large extent, we experience every day a taste of that, because our astral body, the body of desires, the body that we cognize with, that's that which streams to us out of the future. It exhausts our etheric body, which is our body of memory and that body of memory we share with the plants, whereas the astral we share with the animals, and the physical is we share with the minerals. So we participate in those three kingdoms, but we dwell above them as a human I am or ego. And so when you enter into understanding what that might be, that led me to look back and try and bring forward again something that I hadn't mentioned in a long time, but that was that years ago I was involved in a project with Ralph Marinelli, who was one of the three directors of the Waldorf Institute of Teacher Training here in Michigan. And we worked on a project together because Rudolf Steiner had said that the heart is not a pump. And according to Aaron Pfeiffer, man's threatened experience of the world in which he lives, that whole fear realm and the chaotic relationship to it, was essentially tied into wrong ideas as to how the heart functions. And so I worked with Ralph for several years and in proving that the heart was not a pump, which we were able to do. And there was an article produced by Ralph and Dr. Branko First and Dr. Hoyt van der Zee and Andrew McGinn and his son, Dr. William Marinelli, and James Stuart of the Rudolf Steiner Archive was in on it, and Michael Duffy from Emerson College in the UK. So there was a whole group of people that were tied into this article, of which I was like, what you might call the medical editor. And in doing this, the article is "The Heart is Not a Pump, a Refutation of the Pressure Propulsion Premise of Heart Function." And it was published in the 1995 Fall-Winter issue, Volume 5, Number 1 of Frontier Perspectives, the journal of the Center for Frontier Sciences at Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And so there's a link below that you could check out the article. Or a précis of the article, so to speak. And so when I did that work with Ralph, we were able to accomplish that task. And of course, not having all those credentials, my name isn't on the article, which I could care less. But it was fascinating, all the scientific experiments we did at that time. But as I moved away from that project, I was to write a book. And so the fruit of the book of doing the work about the heart is my first book, The Arcana of the Grail Angel. And in there, I try to give an expression of the multifaceted nature of the heart, its cosmological considerations. And so that's how I got to that. And I just wanted to touch base on that because some people might be wondering, why is that link below? And so that's why it's there. But in any regard, I think that very much ties into the comment or the statement by St. John the Divine that God is love.
I'm sort of against this modern academy expulsion of experience and learning simply because it doesn't have a bit of credits, a few credits behind it. You should have been named on that article. I mean, in the really old days, you would have been. Steppenwolf, by the guy cut my literary teeth on, Hermann Hesse. There's one wonderful bit in the novel, again, present company accepted. It's just, it reminded me of you. You're Steppenwolf, not who he's criticizing. You know, the American academic turns up and he feels he's got to make a display as opposed to talk about knowledge. And Steppenwolf simply looks at the protagonist across the room and everybody knows exactly where they stand. The old scholars wouldn't have cared about those things. They would have included, people tend to forget what it was like. And there are hardly any left now. I mean, not defending their limitations, but certainly defending their standards, which ironically were more inclusive than nowadays. You have to adopt a particular party line nowadays to be included in anything, which is why the expulsion of people who should be in the academy has actually taken place. in almost a neo-Maoist fashion, which is never discussed. But that's another interesting thing in itself. I don't think we should be too harsh on Sir Francis. I mean, the Royal Academy was largely founded upon his work and attitudes, and certainly he, as far as I understand it, I mean, he was an adept. He would have seen the scientific grading into the mystical, albeit in a very different way from us. And yeah, I mean, you know, I never go back from my base opinion that our ancestors were bastards. It's just what they were. But yeah, he would have seen a unique link at some point. He would have seen a tie-in. So science would eventually have become the esoteric, and that would eventually become something religious. I had his character on stage when I was co-producing, directing Shakespeare Tonight, which we took to the Edinburgh Fringe and the Edinburgh Festival. Sir Francis Bacon actually is one of the characters in the play. It's a brilliant play by Paul Wilson. You know, what would happen if Shakespeare was around nowadays? He'd be on a chat show because no one would go and see the plays if he didn't get his fizzog out there in the media. So it's a brilliant idea. And of course, it's not real. You know, in the play, his great rival, Shakespeare's great rival, is Sir Francis Bacon. And the actor, Gary Voss, a very, very famous East European actor, was wondering how to play it. And when we first started, I noticed it was this straight-laced, learned, you know, person, you know, all the charm and intellect of a test tube. So I basically said, no, I don't want that. Can we play him like Ming the Merciless in Flash Gordon? And that seemed to work a lot better. Yeah, and particularly with the confrontations between them two, between the two of them, that worked extremely well. And there's one point where they're both sat in an Oprah Winfrey type, you know, green room. A niggling row has just started, and the character Shakespeare's had enough, and he picks up a letter opener and says, "Is this a dagger I see before me?" And they were worried about what to do next. And I said, look, Gary, I just want you laughing. You're an aristocrat. You can have him bumped off whenever you want to. So, you know, he's like, ha, 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 ha. Was the response of Sir Francis Bacon? Yeah, I think we're going to be too careful of tarring him with that brush. I mean, I remember reading Karl Marx for the first time, and in some ways feeling enlightened. I confess that. I mean, I was aware that this was partially written when he was stepping over kids in the street suffering from malnutrition with no social support whatsoever, and women begging for money for food for their families because there were no mechanisms. And it's that sort of thing that got up his nose a great deal. And I remember reading in I can't remember which book it is, you know, the sum, whereas Hegel says it's the sum total of spiritual forces, I claim, paraphrasing massively, I claim it's the sum total of social forces that are individuated and individualized in a particular human person. And I did think, wow, that's incredibly interesting. You know, my trouble is that it didn't really answer anything. Hegel does answer things, whereas that didn't answer things. Okay, where does all that originate? And why is that the model? And why do you find that the best description of a human being? Because personally, I don't. I find it a description, and quite a profound description, but not, you know, a definitional description. I don't think that goes far enough. So yeah, perhaps my Hegelianism was reasserting itself, but I found problems with that. But you know, I'm more power to him. You know, a guy looking for answers at a time which was more brutish and brutal. We forget that. Maybe not as brutish and brutal as the time Sir Francis lived in, but still brutish and brutal. So yeah, I mean, the fact that the spiritual, the psychic. I mean, I tend to love free church, as everybody knows. I mean, I feel a great empathy with Pentecostalism, ironically, where they're looking for the experience. I mean, they never admit the paranormal, but let's face it, that's what happens at some of these revival meetings. And sometimes they claim the supernatural itself actually turns up. which I never say no to. You never know. I mean, in the depths, in the heights of these meetings, who's entirely certain what's going on and what's not going on? And as I say repeatedly on this show, simply because it's true, one of my current heroes is T.D. Jakes. I think he's a Pentecostalist, an absolutely remarkable man. Bit limited on LGBT issues, but a remarkable man. Listening to him speak and looking at the atmosphere only on visuals, sadly, looking at the atmosphere he creates at some of his revivals. Who can say what's occurring and not occurring? It's just too deep, it's too strong, it's too beautiful to deny that. Certainly our attitude, our access to those things in the past, I suspect would have been more head on, and therefore possibly lacked the finesse, lacked the sophistication with which it is going to return. I can actually see our new relationship with these things as working on a much more profound level in some ways, and a much more genuinely interactive way. I always get the impression of Mother Shipton, the witch of England, going back way back when, whose Book of Prophecies are very unsettling, because you can see some of them where they're heading towards something very unsettling. So what used to happen was the spirits used to speak to her directly, and she'd be the mouthpiece. But is that really what will happen in the future, as far as I understand spiritual science? No, we're looking at something much more refined and interactive, where we speak with and enjoy the knowledge of the spirit and collaborate more than simply mouth what these energies are intending. I personally find that very exciting. But mind you, I was reading Celine earlier today. My admiration for Shakespeare and never Shakespeare and Co. It's Shakespeare Tonight, Shakespeare and Co. Not Shakespeare Tonight, the play, Shakespeare and Co. The French bookshop. I love the fact that you were this huge bibliomaniac at one point. I think that's wonderful. I'd forgotten what a huge influence Celine had been on, since we're speaking of sophistication, on French literature, and I knew she'd been a bit of a woman. What I didn't know was that she'd had an affair, like Woody Allen, with one of her adopted sons. My God, the Frenchies kept that quiet. So, Bishop David being shocked on a Sunday morning, and still winning every literary medal under the sun. I hate her. And then going on to Margaret Atwood, I was preparing for something this morning, and I hate her too, actually. I can't stand The Handmaid's Tale. Oh, get over it. Get over it. But even then, and people haven't read that book properly either. I mean, what is it, about 200 years from now? But it's actually written 400 years from now, where there's some sort of Latin professor who's listening to the recordings of Offred. And the only good bit of the book, he doesn't like her. Ha! You handmaid cow, he doesn't like you. So that's the best bit of the book. I always suspect, because maybe of the accumulated wisdom of literature that not only maps where we have been, but projects, but postulates, but speculates about where we will go. A much more, a much more sanctified relationship with these things than anything our ancestors could ever have dreamed with, where a social conscience isn't necessarily tied in with grim materialism, and where interacting with higher forces and higher levels of consciousness isn't simply mouthing mysteries that we can't hope to understand. Oh my God, that's too optimistic, but that's roughly what I'm thinking today. Handing back to you, John.
Atwood, yes. Well, it just makes me think of Marianne Atwood, who was the authoress, they called them that back then, the authoress of A Suggestive Inquiry into Hermetics, which is like really profound because of her access to General Ethan Allen Hitchcock's alchemical library. And so I have a great fondness for a whole series of female occultists that I find keep them very close to heart. They have a certain pliability of intellect that is sometimes lacking in their male counterparts. And so, you have your Madame Blavatsky and your Mabel Collins and Marianne Atwood, and they seem to have a certain artistic quality in them, and I like that. Ita Wegman, Rudolf Steiner's associate who started the medical section. I mean, what a poetical soul, who was so self-sacrificing that it's hard to comprehend a being such as that. And Marie Steiner, his wife, a giant in the area of theater, her relationship with Michael Chekhov and Anton Chekhov, excuse me, and Stanislavski. I mean, she came right out of that Russian theater stream, and so it's interesting in the way in which that has been a major influence in my life, and in dealing with the female counterparts in this whole challenge of understanding. I mean, I could go out and maybe we'll do a show just on that one of these days. I didn't really prepare anything to that in that regard, but I did want to share something that goes back to something that we've covered before. But in the past, I made mention of that when they at Harvard came up with the IQ test, that they investigated historical figures, and they figured that the three highest IQs that they were able to come across is Emanuel Swedenborg, who David has written about, and then there's Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, of which has had a very prominent role in Rudolf Steiner's path of life, as he was the editor of Goethe's scientific works. And the third figure is John Stuart Mill, who's On Liberty back in 1859 was a very cogent and powerful statement of how it was really the best way to approach human culture is through liberty. And he says, let us suppose, therefore, that the government is entirely at one with the people and never thinks of exerting any power of coercion unless in agreement with what it conceives to be their voice. But I deny the right of the people to exercise such coercion, either by themselves or by their government. The power itself is illegitimate. The best government has no more title to it than the worst. It is as noxious or more noxious when exerted in accordance with public opinion than when in opposition to it. If all mankind minus one were of one opinion, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. But the peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race, posterity as well as the existing generation, those who dissent from the opinion still more than those who hold it. If the opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth, produced by its collision with error. We can never be sure that the opinion we are endeavoring to stifle is a false opinion. And if we were sure, stifling it would be an evil still. So I'm with him. I think that's well, the way we have to look at this is that there's, in the pursuit of what is truth, unless you allow the possibility of falsehood, you're never going to get there, because it's always, again, going back to Reverend David's hero, Hegel. I mean, mind you, Hegel considered himself to be a Christian mystic. That's basically what we're looking at here. And yet he is one of the, if not the most quoted philosopher of the last 200 years or so, right? So there's a great deal put behind his way of expressing the idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, that whole threefold cognitive formula that actually he derived from Fichte. But people in America, they don't know who's this Fichte guy. But anyway, he's the guy that Rudolf Steiner's teacher told him to study Fichte the last time he saw him. And so there must be something worthwhile there, I would suspect. But there's actually some really good work being done with Fichte studies by David Adams. But in any regards, there's a phenomenology of spirit. Yes, wonderful. Yeah, what a mind. And so I guess what I want to say is that there's some really smart people that are concerning themselves with these things. And again, going back to Rudolf Steiner, and I've made this point before, but I have to make it again and again because it doesn't always sink in. He'll go back to and take a single word. Like he'll take the word that's translated in the Bible as messenger, and he does this in reference to John the Baptist and also in reference to Ezekiel. And he says, the word there is messenger. Well, what's the Greek in the sentence? And it's angelos. That an angel was expressing through this individual. Angel being the next stage beyond a human, right? Like your guardian angel, for example. And so you have that. And that whole thing, the point you're making about the forces and trying to turn the spiritual world into just another level of abstraction and forces, I'm of the ilk that sees it as beings, and that these are all states of consciousness. But in any regard, to go into that and then to take another word, like, for example, in the background of the Gospel of St. Mark that I made reference to earlier by Rudolf Steiner, and in there he makes reference to Jesus confounding the elders at the temple, right? As 12 years old, goes into the temple and confounds the scribes and Pharisees, but the reference is made. They translated and he spoke with authority. Well, if you look at the Greek scripture of that, instead of authority, it's kuriotetes. And what is a kuriotetes? Well, a kuriotetes is the spirits of wisdom. So you're talking about that's like exalted beings that are. It's like when you're looking at a beautiful sunset, for example, it's an expression of the activity of the kuriotetes, the spirits of wisdom, and the dunamis, the spirits of movement, and the exousiae, the spirits of form. So those are the three levels of being beyond the angels, archangels, and archai. And then it goes, exousiae, dunamis, kuriotetes in the system of Dionysius, the Areopagite. So this is a very high level of being. And so to say that Jesus was speaking as a kuriotetes, that's greatly different. I don't know many confessions I'd go to and get that kind of an explanation. And so I consider the Bible to be a book for the future, and that people's language skills on a level of mystery language, not just on a level of getting into slicing and dicing, and and getting into the linguistics of it, because they tend to miss the point because they don't have a context for sorting out mystery language. Although I find a better, shall we say, a more fertile ground to investigate when I was working and created that 15,000 volume database on ancient Near East and Egypt and all of that. I found that it was many of the scholars of the Greek literature that are more capable of perhaps coming to those kinds of understandings. And so you see kind of an inclination, for example, in the works of Thomas Taylor in his translations of the Neoplatonic authors and Plato and all of that. I mean, I have right over here. What's this? What's this? Which one's this? There you go. The Theology of Plato. Thomas Taylor's translation of Proclus's Theology of Plato, and I have his commentaries on the Timaeus too. And so, but these are books that are very, very, very difficult to penetrate for most people because our education has been so subpar for so long. I mean, I saw an exam a few years ago of an 8th grader from the late 1800s. And in looking at that test, the final exam, it was clear to me that a college graduate of today would have failed that test. So we've kind of declined in that department. And so it behooves us perhaps to try and at least artistically approach these things. As far as expecting people to be able to grapple with the ficta, that's a bit of a stretch. Although I don't want to discourage them, but it's a beautiful thing. It's like walking through a meadow once again, but in a more kind of intense, concentrated way. But in coming to understanding that we can approach this thing artistically through myths and legends and fairy tales, Grimm's fairy tales that are real fairy tales, not the Hans Christian Andersen. They're nice, but they made them up. The Grimms are ones that had been carried down through tradition, but that these things would give us archetypes that we can build into our being that Rudolf Steiner says will give us a capacity in future incarnations to be able to unlock some of these mysteries.
We love Hans Christian Andersen, you swine. And what was it, that movie with Danny Kaye years ago? Inchworm. Apparently he invited himself to the home of Charles Dickens and overstayed his welcome. He'd been there about a month. And Charles, who could be very businesslike when he wanted to, he told him to sod off because how long have you been here now? And apparently, our lovely little citizen of Copenhagen didn't realise what was going on. He couldn't understand it at all. Oh, poor innocent soul. No, I think, what was it? The Little Mermaid, the Match Girl. Oh no, I love all of it. Yeah, and you mustn't. People mustn't assume that I'm attacking female scholarship, or indeed feminism. I remember. The left, you have to have all these labels nowadays. I'm not a leftist. I remember somebody giving me a litany of titles not too long ago about how they were a feminist as well, which was a man struck me as rather amusing. So you're just another man telling women what to do, yeah? And they couldn't see the irony in that. I'm not. I mean, I'm an egalitarian. I believe in the equality of both genders, of every gender. And I do like gender studies. That started, of course, because of discoveries in the Human Genome Project. But that's a show in itself. My God. Because what everybody has done is jumped on the discoveries that haven't even really been digested by the scientific community yet. It's too early. So nobody's quite sure what it means. But as usual, everybody's got something to say, and I've been oppressed for 1,000 years. No. This is why if science becomes too commercialized, we end up with massive problems like the one we've got at the minute. I mean, speaking personally, excuse me, I keep sipping at water because I've got a constant frog in my throat today. I mean, I moved in LGBT circles for the majority of my life. I've met two transgender ladies. I've met lots of people who said they were, but people say all sorts of things, don't they? If a career's involved or it's a poor publicity week, I mean, people say all sorts of things. And so, and both of them were very stately, very intelligent, and rather saddened people because they just knew they'd never find the right fit in a society like ours. And the whole thing was really quite depressing. And my heart goes out to them as opposed to wanting to engage them in debate. The minute you're engaged in debate, you're admitting there's a career involved. So no, the whole thing struck me as rather sad. Feminist scholarship. Madam Alexandra David Neal, of course, is one of my seminal authors, you know, the great influence on me. And first wave feminists, I mean, some of the things they say were absolutely extraordinary about the minimization of women in Western culture. To this day, I remember my ears ringing with some of them, thinking, "Oh my God, that's self-evident," but nobody said it. So no, I wasn't attacking the unique, the alternative voice given by female scholarship. Vive la différence. I don't want everybody reduced to this sort of amorphous blob. I mean, I actually do believe in differences, and why are they such a bad thing? They can be used in a bad way, but why are they such a bad thing? Which sort of leads me, I suppose, to another argument. I mean, because one of them is actually a very, very famous novelist. I don't know if she'll want me to talk about it. Who is a Wagnerian. We're both Wagnerians. An article in what was it, the European, that journal came out recently, but it was in a couple of places. You know, where are all the Wagnerians now? Well, here's one for a start. I'm growing my hair so I can become Dr. Longhair, as they used to be called in various circles. Yeah, and someone was bitching about how you couldn't have many more evenings in Bayreuth with the Meister singers. And, you know, oh, where was it? My trouble with the right, stop bloody moaning. In life, there's a few laughs in life, believe it or not. Stop bloody moaning. And how many more times would we be able to be in the middle of Bayreuth at midnight, thinking of the Meister singers, which had only just stopped? We'll book your tickets for next year. There we are. There's the next time that you can be doing that. And I noticed on my social media, you know, life being life, it was all my lefty friends that were piling to say, leave Wagner alone. When it was the right wingers who were feeling browbeaten and got at. So life being a great mystery yet again. So, oh gosh, I suspect unique voices are what we need to encourage more than amorphous voices. I mean, yeah, I confess Hegel being this overarching influence on me. I always get drawn back to him beneath the others, if that makes any sense. Kierkegaard is one of those people which I always need to reorient myself in Christianity. If I need to do that, I go to Kierkegaard. And of course, you get all of those free church ideas. I don't think he was the father of existentialists. Certainly, talking about those ideas, excuse me, doesn't mean you're the father or something. I don't think he'd have liked that. And the fact that he's so snipey about Hegel interests me. The fact that Schopenhauer, someone else I keep going back to, as this, oh God, if you're looking for moody pundits, Schopenhauer, a brilliant man, but cheer up a bit. Go and have a glass of wine. You know, is everything suffering like Buddha? Look, did he mean that? Don't take things out of context and go and enjoy yourself. So an incredibly great man, don't get me wrong, but you know, one level. Although there's a multiplicity of levels suggested in the work, Hegel for me was one of those remains one of those genuinely unique voices. He's looking for the absolute. He does identify as a Christian mystic, I think if you're talking about principles of logic or states of consciousness, it's far from unclear in someone like Hegel whether he denies their beings. What he would have done is say, why are we looking at that question before we really understand what that question is? I mean, surely that's something we'd look at after the antithesis. I mean, how can we possibly know whether they're entifications, whether they're actual entities, beings or not? I mean, and is it the job of humanity at this stage to know that? I mean, surely our jobs are to do with producing a more intelligent and equal culture. Why are we worrying about those things? And he would curiously be forced into a position of prayer. If you feel that that's not happening, and and it cannot happen, what is your prayer life like? That's an oddity in Hegel. People, a suggestive element in Hegel people don't really seem to see. I remember reading his philosophy of right, elements of the philosophy of right, which doesn't mean he's a right winger. Everything has a historical context. He's more akin, I think, to John Stuart Mill in many, many ways than the right wing thinkers at that time. I mean, what he's looking for is a balance in the organic totality of society and culture. And I think that's actually very, very profound. And of course, the book I just held up, really, what is religion about? There are too many people telling us what we've got to think and what we've got to do, and not really addressing the questions of our good Lord. What is it? Where can it go wrong? And what are we meant to do about it? Which are implicit in the whole of his ministry. Therefore, Hegel, for me, I'm not saying for anybody else, for me is always sort of the key into that particular lock. And for me, manages to unlock many of the scholars I wouldn't have understood otherwise, including Rudolf Steiner. Hegel had a certain amount to say upon Goethe, which I'm still thinking about, because Hegel can be very sharp. When he's not being sharp about people, I want to think about it for a long time. I mean, he wasn't sharp about my other hero, Schiller, who, of course, ostensibly wrote about art, creativity, the play instinct, and he wasn't sharp about him and actually called Schiller a philosopher, which is the greatest epithet Hegel could award to somebody. So for me, he's a much more nuanced thinker than people think. I suspect he'd have loved first wave feminism. How about that for an irony? I suspect he'd have loved the whole corpus of Steiner and the anthroposophical exercise, the anthroposophical enterprise, dare I say, because you're looking at something non-passive. I mean, he was really irritated by passive Christianity, although, as I said a minute ago, a lot of free churches tend towards that sort of Kierkegaardian, I might be right, I might be wrong, but this is where I stand, but I'm not really checking it against other people's experiences because I know I'm right underneath. I mean, that's not what Kierkegaard would have said. Test everything against the scripture, test everything against the Holy Spirit. And Hegel says, yes, but that's the beginning. Test it about, how you're living your life, how you're expressing these ideals. What are you actually doing as a Christian to warrant the title Christian? I mean, Hegel dives in with both feet and both fists flailing, and I think that's actually what we need for modern times. Do we need a gentle? And he was, I mean, this beautifully Danish romantic figure like Kierkegaard. Or do we need a sort of get stuck in Hegel? Well, no, justify what you're saying. Justify what you're saying. Just because you're saying it doesn't mean it's automatically true. Justify it. I think we need, with empathy, although he had empathy, we need that approach to return. So, yeah, I confess him as a hero. Is that the right word? I confess him as a hero, a role model, the moody schoolmaster of down Germany way. But, yeah, and as I say, for me, if you're not using him as a key to other authors, then probably he'd have given you an F grade like he used to give Marx, which I bet none of those essays have survived with Hegel's big red F at the bottom of the paper. My God, wouldn't that be great? And also, it's what we all need as Christians nowadays. Every now and again, we need an F grade. What are you doing about all of this? Yeah, you stood up in church and you're proselytizing, you're doing this and you're doing that. Is the science of the spirit guiding you to a better life and leading you to the cosmic spirit? And if not, you're doing something wrong. Handing back, John.
Yes. Kind of caught me there. Yeah, well, you know, I think that in trying to get, I'm always trying to build a meta narrative. What I like to see is a meta narrative. What is the big picture, and try to approach things from 60,000 feet, and then bring it into focus, as opposed to not seeing the forest for the trees, to where you get so confined within a particular expression that you can't see its relationship to other things. You know, for example, your whole journey there through talking about right and left. By the way, Wagner would be considered on the left. You know, he's just so people aren't confused in that regard. He was all about his social contributions, and he was very much a social activist. And in fact, there were times I was just watching some of the biographical films of George Sand and with Chopin and that whole milieu, and there was Franz Liszt, and of course Richard Wagner married Franz Liszt's daughter Cosima, and there were times in which Wagner would be in another city and he would have to mail his libretto for his new opera to Franz Liszt and have Franz Liszt put it on, because Wagner kept getting in trouble with the authorities because he didn't care much for the aristocracy. He thought that he wanted a fairer society, and that whole thematic development of nationalism that came out of Wagner, that was the basis of what it was about. Is that all these little, at the time, there were all these little principalities and different states that constituted Germany. It was not a nation. It was just a bunch of quasi aristocratic territories, you know, and that it really didn't go very well for the ordinary people. And he wanted to remedy that, and the work that he did with his operas in trying to generate a consolidation of the German people into their folk soul and have them all work together, he felt could lead to a better state of living for all the German people. And of course, there's always a downside to everything. There's a good side, there's a downside. And so his whole approach was then co-opted by the National Socialists, and the rest is history. You know, that it got degraded through association. And likewise, the works of Nietzsche also went through the same kind of problem. And you know, so that there is that. And Martin Heidegger too, for that matter, because he got co-opted, he got labeled. And so it's very difficult to evaluate things when you don't have a measure of understanding of history. And so that's the real key, and understanding who said it and why they said it and what was the context in which they were saying it. Because currently, like for example, in the U.S., well, it's hard to weigh in on that conversation because we're not in the struggling proletariat against the aristocracy. That supposedly, that's not what supposedly we're doing here. Although you could question that if you look further under the hood, because it seems to be the same cast of characters at the top of the pile. But that being said, I don't want to get off into all the weeds with all that kind of stuff, because I like this to be a little bit more uplifting. And so in answer to that, I guess I could share with you that Reverend David has some uplifting ideas in his books that are available on Amazon. Here's a Grammar of Witchcraft, and no, it's not a grimoire. It's not going to teach you how to do tricks. And here's this Shakespearean-esque poetry, and that's not him on the cover. And his major work is Mount Athos Inside Me, Essays on Religion, Swedenborg and the Arts, edited by the very talented Daniela Irandust. And like I said, these are all available on Amazon. And I have 2 books that I've written thus far. My first book is The Arcana of the Grail Angel, the Spiritual Science of the Holy Blood and of the Holy Grail, a study developed out of the work of Rudolf Steiner of the underground streams of esoteric Christianity which flowed from the Brotherhood of the Holy Grail to the Order of the Knights Templar and the True Rosicrucian Order, as a forward by my best friend Douglas Gabriel, and it has a great many diagrams and extensive bibliography, and the whole series of diagrams are reproduced in my second volume, plus I created a great many more. And there's my translation of the alchemical poem of the Comte Saint-Germain, and here's my diagrams. And if I just flick through them, see that can help keep your thinking organized within spiritual science, which is one of the challenges when confronted with 36.5 feet of shelf space full of books. That's the collected edition of Rudolf Steiner's work that encompasses over 6,700 lectures and over 50 books and articles and all of that. So it's just a massive undertaking studying his work. So it's helpful to be able to keep it all organized. And so my books are available on eBay for me directly here in the continental US. If you're outside of there and in other countries, you can contact me directly through my academia link below or by private message on Facebook, and we can work out an arrangement through PayPal to where you can have the books shipped directly to you. And also I want to thank the contributions of Tyla and Vadim that make this podcast possible, and also the other people that are contributing as well. And there's a great many of them to name, so they know I'm speaking of them. And so that being said, we still have some time left. And I want to make sure that we bring this to a thoughtful resolution so that it becomes something that's heartwarming rather than chilling. So much today is chilling. And I think that that's a real key in understanding the world and the way in which it works. And so that led me the other day, let's see if I can dig it up quickly enough, that I found my computer's running a little slow, but here we go. And I apologize for taking too long. Where is it? It is, good old Clara Schumann, the virtuoso pianist and composer. And Clara Schumann, I posted her complete piano works the other day. And but there was a quotation of hers I really, really like. The tea is ice cold, the room grows colder and colder, but I grow warmer and warmer. And so that's a nice thought. I mean, to me, she's one of the most lyrical of the classical composers. And for the last few years, I've really gravitated more towards that lyrical approach. And that's why I've been so caught up with Chopin and also violin concertos. I mean, there's just something uplifting about it. And, I mean, I like pop music. Geez, I was in the music business for many years, but there's no comparison to some of the great works of classical music.
Gosh, yeah, I mean, I consider you in my circle. You've got to tell me at some point if you had any confreres. What was it? The Black Mountain Institute, the Black Mountain University. I mean, that's where most of the people I'm talking about in Europe, actually, at least their works ended up, and people were talking about them and evolving that approach. I mean, I've heard some wonderful things. I've read some of it, not much of it, but I've read some wonderful things about what happened there. What was it? Charles Olson, Letters to Maximus. I've not read it yet in full. I've read it in part. So, yeah, I mean, lots of people thinking of the European milieu got their fingers burnt by National Socialism and its incredible cultural abuses by claiming everything was National Socialism, which they liked, and decrying everything as not National Socialism, which they didn't like. I mean, that's Maoism. That's the Cultural Revolution a la Mao. You're either on our side or you're not. By the way, you're on our side and we've got a gun. So you've got to really think about what's happening there. Oh, yeah. Thinking of oddities, I don't know. You said so many things, and I'm not sure how to respond to them. I like what happened to American Letters. I'm sort of, I don't know. I don't dislike the pop genre either. It's just it doesn't. I mean, it strikes me now as business nowadays as opposed to music. I mean, some of those young black artists. I don't want to name names because I'm still thinking about it. Some of these rapper boys, if you don't think that's poetry, you're not listening to what they're doing. And if you don't really appreciate the skill, then your ears are deaf to poetry. I mean, I sort of used to like, what was that guy, an American guy that everybody's accusing? He's in the industry one minute and he's out of the industry the next. Eminem. I admire his artistry, if not particularly him as a person. But I hate whingers. Shut up, man. I'm cleaning out your closet. I'm sorry, is that a threat? And who's the threat aimed at? And I noticed his family were very uneasy when he laid that track down. But it just strikes me as not really on the same level as, oh God, this is where I sound like a dinosaur, of a Bob Dylan. I mean, you're not really, if there was a rapper on that level, then that would be really something mind-blowing. Although I have a confession to make, indirectly and loosely, I know Ice-T. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but he likes my poetry and sent me a very complimentary letter a couple of years ago. So thank you, Ice-T. I hope everything's cooking for you. Must mention you at some point. Yeah, I mean, in terms of circles of influences, in circles of colleagues, I suspect I'm a Yankee boy from a distance. The flower of romanticism after the Second Great War certainly wasn't in Europe. It was so many terrible things had happened here. It was really a utilitarian series of countries where survival on the level of state, every state is a lie. Nietzsche is correct, but sometimes they're useful for the survival of a population. People had to survive. I mean, the level of debt that Britain was in because of World War II was only recently paid off, of course. And the terrible social and cultural and moral and religious atrocities that had happened really dazed everybody. I'm still convinced my mother's generation, which is sort of, they were in the war, they were around at the time of the war, but they were too young to actually do much about it. I mean, the level of trauma that must have been theirs that we tend to forget, which is what makes me so impatient with millennials. Not because I don't think they've good ideals, so many of them do. And they've got a beautifully progressive attitude, which can only be applauded. But you've got to think, hang on, go to my generation and the one back, and then you're looking at major trauma by an existential life and death scenario called World War II, which is, you had to get to the front or be shot here or incarcerated here or something terrible would happen here. And you had to go and do what you had to do, whether you wanted to or not. And that goes through my mother's generation into my generation, which is sort of putting out, I don't know, trying to orient again. And, what does all this mean and what on earth has happened and where are we going from here? I think that explains the flower power thing, which is underrated and misunderstood. As a reaction, was it a new flowering of consciousness? I always read that more as a reaction against what had been before. And it flower power flowered, but it bloomed best in America, where, of course, it didn't have those clinging existential soils pulling everything down by the sheer grim experience of what had happened on everybody's doorstep. I mean, I lost a couple of uncles. My family lost a couple of uncles in World War II, which were still discussed until very recently. We've got to remember, where these things work best and how they come to fruition best. And American debate is bewildering, I think, to most of the rest of us in certain ways at the minute. But it's healthy and it needs to happen. And what to my mind, I don't know, whatever happened to the beatnik generation? I'm keeping an eye on the time, I promise. And the wonderful poetry, the wonderful music. Someone described the beatniks a few years ago over here as a mixture of jazz players seeking Zen in Mexico. What's wrong with that? That sounds great. But yeah, I mean, we need to remember what we're going through as a cultural process. I mean, right, to round off quickly, leading back to my comment on Wagner, what American youth, it seems to be doing at the moment, and I'm a mere foreigner, so what do I know, is giving an either or, either you're with us or you're against us, which is never healthy. But they're impatient for real change. Dear youth of America, we're all impatient for real change. It's just what's the best way of doing it? And, you're not either on the side of Wagner or against. I mean, one of my potential colleagues, though I've not even spoken to him yet, Felix Barrett, is one of the new darlings of British theatre, and he, of course, is behind the whole immersive movement. And I have a great deal to say about that academically over at the end of this year and maybe early next year, primarily in Norway, curiously. How can you? Surely you're just looking at different facets of spirit. One night you want the elevated, the vast, the superlative, and the next night maybe you want something more experimental, more earthy, more direct. I think it's very dangerous to have this yes, no, right, wrong attitude without synthesis, and that's the bit that's gone missing at the minute in our society. Everybody's forgotten the Hegelian synthesis that crowns the whole process. Handing back to you, John.
Well, yeah, in light of all the statements I just made about Chopin and classical music, and, you could include Beethoven and Wagner and that whole cast of characters. But don't forget, I was instrumental in getting John Lee Hooker's last record deal before he passed away. And so I'm very sensitive to all the various types of music. I remember a very dear friend of mine, Eve Hardy, who she was an anthroposophist, but she was Ornette Coleman's girlfriend back in the early 60s, and they lived in Greenwich Village, and John Coltrane and Eric Dolphy and Joe Henderson, all the Pharoah Sanders, all these people would stop by and jam in her living room in Greenwich Village, and the neighbors never complained. But Eric Dolphy, what a character he was. He lived in upstate New York, and he would go out in the backyard and he would improvise on his flute with the songbirds. And there's a great many songbirds in upstate New York, and he even has on his album The Last Date. It was the last recorded live gig of his. He has a tune he does on there. And it's basically, he's quoting like these songbirds. It's just absolutely remarkable that he has that kind of an ear to be able to play some of those intricate northern songbird melodies. So, yes, jazz, it's really futuristic in many regards, because it has to do with such an open set, so to speak, approach to music beyond categories. And the same thing with the a modern literature. You see that expressed. You see that, the influence. You mentioned Maximus, Charles Olson. Yeah, well, he's kind of a successor to Ezra Pound, and that's whole postmodernist, very stripped down language, but a very deep historical context. All of a sudden just swing into quoting, a Latin author in Latin, and so it's like studying Charles Olson, like studying Pound's cantos. It's a challenge of deciphering them. Okay, what's he talking about now? Who is he referencing? And so it is truly an adventure, and really the fact that Ezra Pound, in spite of all his flaws, of which he had many, nonetheless, there's a whole group of authors that it wasn't until he edited their work that they received the Nobel Prize for Literature. I mean, geez, it's just, the list is so long. And so you have to be able to see things and understand that just because somebody's a good tennis player doesn't mean you necessarily will value their political opinions, or if somebody happens to be in music, you're going to want to question them about early medieval literature. And so that's just the way life is. And so you can't really simplify your quest in attempting to have an opinion. And that being said, I think maybe what we really need at this point is to have this consecrated in one of Reverend David's wonderful prayers.
I'll just be cheeky and say two things. I know we're running rapidly out of time. Yeah, I wrote an article in Ezra Pound for International Relations a couple of years ago, and I think certain difficulties in his biography can be explained by being a crushed idealist. And if anybody wants to read that article, please, either, if you can't find it, get in touch with me, because I think we've all been far too harsh on Ezra Pound and not really understood what the issues were and what the milieu was. Secondly, why I'm resisting an either or, and I feel part of the American Academy more than any European one, is I remember being taken for tea in the Ritz a couple of years ago, and the pianist, you have a wonderful pianist like Liberace in the middle wearing a white suit with a white piano, apologizing to me for not being able to play Chopin because no one in the room would have heard of it or have understood the music apart from me. My God, whatever happened to the Ritz? So that was the link there. Right, but we're running out of time, my friends, and isn't it great we're all back in the saddle and having our Sunday meetings again? Anyway, it's always darkest before the dawn. I mean, we've got so many problems in our culture, our societies at the minute. We've got so many oppressions and so many disagreements and so many arguments. But, there are bigger pictures, there are bigger paradigms, there are bigger frames of reference for all of us. We're political animals, we're social animals, we're cultural animals, but we're also the sons and daughters of God. My friends, as we miss each other in the hours, the days, and the week ahead, Let's remember that our little community is turning into an engine, really seeking something to do with truth and beauty and goodness. And if that helps any of us in our lives to understand those things, we need to be exceedingly grateful. I'm not going to give a formal prayer. What I'm going to do is ask the Spirit of truth, which some of us believe is Jesus Christ himself, to actually be with us in our words, in our deeds, and in our interactions with those loved ones around us in the week ahead. May all of us be blessed in this fashion. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everybody. And especially thank you, Reverend David, for your stalwartness